Steel built the Soviet war machine, and steel has kept Russia's tanks and warships rolling off the line ever since. But right now, deep inside Russia's steel empire, something is quietly starting to crack. Across the country, steel plants are slashing production, cutting workers loose, and warning that new orders are simply vanishing. At first glance, it looks like an ordinary industrial slump, the kind any economy weathers now and then. It isn't. This crisis reaches straight into the beating heart of Russia's defense machine, and one factory sits at the center of it all. That factory is called the Zlatoust Metallurgical Plant, sitting deep inside Russia's Ural Mountains in Chelyabinsk region. It is quietly responsible for producing a material without which much of Russia's military production would struggle to keep moving. Newly uncovered documents just proved exactly how fragile that one factory's supply chain actually is. An investigation published in April 2026 obtained real shipping contracts, procurement paperwork, and delivery records showing precisely how one critical metal reaches that plant, moving from mines in Iran through a company registered in a tax-free zone in the country of Georgia before finally arriving inside Russia. Zlatoust plant forges the high-grade steel used inside Russian BMP fighting vehicles, T-80 tanks, military aircraft engines, and naval equipment. Here's what makes this story genuinely significant. The investigation didn't just confirm that this supply chain exists. It revealed something inside Russia's own paperwork that Moscow almost certainly never intended the outside world to see. Proof that the backup plan behind this entire operation is already struggling on its own. To understand exactly what that means and why it matters for the wider war, you need to see how this supply chain actually works, piece by piece. The material at the center of this story is called ferrochrome, an alloy of iron and chromium that Zlatus needs to produce its specialized military-grade steel. Without a steady supply of it, the plant simply cannot make the kind of steel Russia's tank and aircraft factories depend on. The investigation traced one specific contract, dated back to 2021, worth $6 million, connecting three parties directly. An Iranian company that operates chromite mines, a company registered in the Tbilisi Free Zone in Georgia, and a Russian trading firm that receives the material on Zlatoust's behalf. That contract alone covered roughly 2,400 tons of ferrochrome, shipped across 3 separate deliveries. And this wasn't an isolated, one-time transaction either. Further documentation obtained by investigators shows this same route has continued supplying material well beyond that original 2021 agreement. Now, a natural question arises here. Why route material through Georgia at all, rather than shipping it directly from Iran to Russia? The answer comes down to money movement. Sending payments straight from Russia to Iran faces serious banking scrutiny. The Georgian Free Zone offered a simple workaround, accepting multiple currencies with no tax burden attached, allowing payment to move through Georgia before the material itself continued on toward Russia. Here's the detail that should genuinely change how you view this entire arrangement. Iran was never Russia's only source for this material. Russia also has its own domestic ferrochrome producer, a state-owned company called the Chelyabinsk Metallurgical Plant, located in Russia's Chelyabinsk region, which was supposed to serve as the reliable, sanctions-proof backup to the Iranian supply route. According to an internal company presentation obtained as part of the same investigation, that domestic backup supplier has failed to fully deliver on its own contracts, falling short by 1,470 tons of ferrochrome. The supposedly dependable, entirely domestic alternative to Iran is missing its own delivery targets. What Russia's own trading company chose to do with that information is perhaps the most revealing part of this entire story. Rather than treating the shortfall as a warning sign, that same internal document recommended applying additional pressure on the struggling domestic supplier, specifically to negotiate more favorable terms, including a longer payment deferral period, while that supplier was already known to be dealing with serious sales problems of its own. Globally, this material isn't easy to source either. According to figures cited in the investigation, South Africa produces roughly 41% of the world's ferrochrome. Kazakhstan around 24%, while Russia's own domestic production accounts for only about 6% of global supply. Put all of these details together, and a very different picture forms than the one Moscow would prefer people to see. This isn't a story about Russia cleverly outsmarting international sanctions with a hidden, foolproof supply network. It's a story about one narrow, fragile chain, an Iranian route running through a Georgian tax haven propped up by a domestic backup supplier that can't meet its own orders, all feeding a single Russian plant that a large share of the country's tank, aircraft, and warship production depends on. Zoom out from that one plant, and something even harder to explain comes into view. Russia's military factories are demanding steel at full tilt. Yet, the country's overall steel production has actually fallen to its lowest level in 15 years. Total output for 2025 came in at 67 million metric tons, down 12% from where it stood back in 2021, according to industry figures reported by Russian outlet RBC. And the slide didn't stop there. In the first 3 months of 2026 alone, production fell another 10.4% compared to the same period the year before. Here's why that number should genuinely surprise you. A country actively fighting a major war, with factories producing tanks and artillery around the clock, would normally expect its steel industry to be booming. Instead, Russia's steel sector is producing less than it did back in 2010. The explanation comes down to simple math. Military orders were never large enough on their own to keep this entire industry running. Russian steel has always depended heavily on two separate customer bases: foreign buyers purchasing exports and Russian construction companies, factory owners, and manufacturers buying steel for domestic projects. The war has now damaged both of those customer bases at the same time. Domestic demand alone tells a striking story. A senior executive at Industrial Metallurgical Holding, Alexei Parshukov, reported that the Russian steel consumption inside the country fell 14% in 2025, dropping to its lowest level since 2011. In the first quarter of 2026, consumption fell another 15% compared to the year before. That decline hits different parts of the industry with different force, and looking at specific product types shows just how deep the damage actually runs. By spring 2026, sales of stainless steel products had fallen 37.4% compared to the year before. Long products, the steel used in construction beams and rebar, dropped 42.5%. Hot rolled flat steel, the raw material behind everything from car bodies to appliances, collapsed by 47.5%. These aren't small dips in one corner of the market. They're the entire product range. Russian steelmakers rely on shrinking by close to half within a single year. MMK, one of Russia's largest steel producers, put the scale of the problem in blunt terms through its own chief executive, Pavel Shilyev. Speaking publicly in March 2026, he stated that Russian steel producers now have production capacity that exceeds actual market demand by roughly double. So why has domestic demand collapsed this badly during a wartime economy that's supposedly running hot with military spending? The answer connects directly back to that same war spending. Massive government spending on the war effort pushed inflation sharply higher across Russia. To fight that inflation, Russia's central bank raised its key interest rate all the way up to 21%, the highest level since the early years of Putin's rule. Alexei Parshukov explained exactly what that interest rate actually does to ordinary businesses. At 21%, construction loans become financially unworkable. Auto manufacturing loans become too expensive to justify. Infrastructure projects that depend on borrowed money simply stop moving forward. According to Parshukov, that same crushing rate has also hit shipbuilding, oil and gas equipment, manufacturing, agricultural machinery production, and railcar building. Industries that together once consumed enormous volumes of Russian steel every year and are now placing a fraction of their usual orders. Put those pieces together, and a genuinely uncomfortable pattern emerges. The same war effort that's demanding steel from Russian factories is also the direct cause of the interest rate crushing the customers who used to buy most of that steel. Russia's war machine didn't simply need this industry to keep running. It helped create the exact economic conditions now pulling that industry apart from the inside. That collapse isn't coming from a single direction either. Three separate pressures are converging on Russia's steel industry at the exact same time, and each one makes the others worse. The first pressure comes from outside Russia entirely. Western governments have steadily tightened trade restrictions on Russian steel throughout this war. Export markets tell that story on their own. Between 2021 and 2024, Russia's total steel exports fell by roughly 1/3. Close to 10 million tons of lost volume, as sanctioned Western buyers simply stopped purchasing. Russian producers redirected what they could toward Turkey, China, and other CIS markets instead, but only by accepting deeply discounted prices well below what European buyers had once paid. On the 17th of June 2025, frustration inside Europe boiled over. A coalition of 44 members of the European Parliament, representing multiple political groups, sent a letter to European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen and European Council President Antonio Costa. Their demand was simple. The letter said, "The loophole kept for the import of certain quota of iron and steel products from Russia is gross policy incoherence benefiting Putin's regime and few industrial players, while harming peace, security, and prosperity at large." On the 1st of July 2026, a new European Union regulation took effect, cutting overall steel import quotas by 47% and doubling penalty tariffs on anything above those quotas to 50%. The European Parliament pushed specifically to have Russian and Belarusian steel excluded from the quota system entirely, with members stating plainly that no product melted or cast in either country should have access to any quota at all. Under the finalized agreement, a shrinking transitional allowance for Russian steel slabs still technically continues until September 2028, but the overall direction is unmistakable. Every review of this system moves in the same direction: tighter restrictions, smaller quotas, and steeper penalties. German Vice Chancellor Lars Klingbeil believes there must be a complete end to all steel imports from Russia, as soon as possible. He summed up the political mood behind these restrictions directly, stating that no one could explain to any worker in our steel industry that Europe is still keeping the market open for Putin. Before we go any further, if you're the kind of viewer who wants to understand what's really happening inside Russia's economy, not just follow the headlines, this channel is for you. Subscribe now so you don't miss our next in-depth breakdown. The second pressure comes from a completely different direction: Ukraine's own strike campaign. Ukrainian forces have spent this war systematically targeting Russian fuel depots, oil refineries, and rail infrastructure. Steel production depends heavily on both. Blast furnaces need a constant, reliable fuel supply. Moving raw materials and finished steel products depends on functioning rail networks. As Russian fuel shortages spread and rail freight volumes dropped to their lowest levels in over a decade, the steel industry absorbed additional costs and delays with every single disrupted shipment. The third pressure is the one already described, that same 21% interest rate still crushing domestic demand from within Russia's own economy. According to Severstal's own chief executive, Alexander Shevelev, the central bank's rate was the primary driver behind the sharp domestic consumption decline recorded in both 2025 and the opening months of 2026. Analysts tracking the sector have put a specific number on what recovery would actually require, estimating the industry needs the key rate to fall closer to 12% before demand could meaningfully rebound. As of mid-2026, that rate still sat at 21%, with no confirmed timeline from Russia's central bank for bringing it down. All three of these pressures converge most sharply at exactly the point this story started: the ferrochrome feeding into the Zlatoust plant. Western sanctions made the Iranian supply route necessary in the first place. Logistics disruptions raised the cost and risk of every shipment moving through that chain. And the broader domestic economic collapse is precisely why Russia's own state-owned backup supplier is struggling to meet its delivery targets at all. That fragile pressure eventually stops being an abstract industry problem and becomes something much more personal, because Russia has roughly 100 towns across the country where the local economy exists almost entirely because of one steel plant. In places like these, the same company runs the factory, funds the schools, heats the homes through municipal systems, and employs most working adults in town. When that single company slows down, the entire town slows down with it. Magnitogorsk, home to roughly 400,000 people, exists because of MMK, the same company whose CEO already confirmed cutting capacity to 60%. That slowdown now means frozen investment, halted equipment repairs, and a 10% reduction to management staff across a city that has been built entirely around this one plant since 1932. Cherepovets tells a similar story. Severstal, which employs roughly 50,000 people there and produces close to 1/6 of Russia's total steel output, has cut maintenance spending by 15%, slashed capital investment by 24%, suspended wage increases for its workforce, frozen all new hiring, and halted a major planned iron ore project the company had previously committed to. Smaller towns are feeling this even more directly. The Zlatoust Metallurgical Plant, located in a small city in the same Chelyabinsk region as Zlatoust, was delisted from the Moscow exchange entirely, closed its stainless steel production line, and dismissed more than 300 workers. In a town with no other major employer, that isn't a line item on a corporate report. It's the sudden loss of income for hundreds of families at once. The financial damage at the top of these companies matches what's happening on their factory floors. As reported by a senior analyst, Kirik Chuiko, the ferrous metallurgy industry is sinking deeper into crisis. MMK posted a net loss of 14.9 billion rubles, close to $206 million for the whole of 2025. Severstal's profit for the first quarter of 2026 collapsed by a factor of 370, falling from just over 21 billion rubles the year before to only 57 million rubles. NLMK reported a net deficit of 5.9 billion rubles in that same quarter, nearly 5 times worse than the year before. Across the industry, unpaid wage arrears climbed 114% in the first quarter of 2026 alone, the highest level recorded since 2016. Some factories have taken the extreme step of powering down blast furnaces into what's called hot mothballing, a state where the equipment stays technically preserved for a future restart, but sends a clear signal that full production isn't returning anytime soon. Roughly 3,000 workers have already been formally laid off, with many more quietly shifted onto reduced 4-day work weeks instead of outright dismissal, a common method Russian companies use to avoid showing up in official unemployment figures. Facing losses on this scale, Russia's largest steel producers did what any struggling industry would do. They asked their own government for help. In February 2026, executives from MMK, Severstal, NLMK, and other major producers gathered for a formal meeting chaired by Deputy Prime Minister Denis Manturov, requesting tax relief, specifically delayed payment deadlines on excise and extraction taxes, along with exemptions tied to strategic investment projects. Russia's own finance ministry said no. Chief Investment Officer at Astra Asset Management, Dmitry Polivoy, explained the government's reasoning plainly to Russian business outlet RBC. He said, there simply isn't enough money in the budget to support every struggling industry at once. Analysts at Russia's own Center for Strategic Research have since formally classified the entire steel sector as being in what they call survival mode. Kirill Chuiko, an analyst at BCS World of Investments, went further, warning that without government support, the industry risks sliding back toward conditions last seen in the early 2000s, a period defined by mass plant closures and widespread unemployment across Russia's industrial towns following the 1998 financial crash. Severstal's own CEO, Alexander Shevelev, had already separately compared the current downturn to the turmoil Russia's steel towns experienced back in the 1990s. Not every analyst sees this as a permanent decline, though, and it's worth hearing the other side of this argument fully. Yaroslav Kabakov, an analyst at the investment firm Phenom, laid out a genuinely optimistic scenario for the industry's future. He argued, if the war eventually ends, the need to rebuild damaged territory and infrastructure would create enormous new demand for steel, potentially driving growth in Russian steel company shares not by small percentages, but by entire multiples. That argument runs into a structural problem, though, and it's one worth understanding clearly. A steel industry currently running blast furnaces in standby mode, with skilled workers already shifted onto shortened schedules or leaving the sector entirely, investment frozen, maintenance delayed, and equipment aging without access to Western replacement parts, cannot simply flip a switch back to full capacity the moment new orders start arriving. The physical factories still exist. The trained workforce, the deferred maintenance, and the financing needed to actually restart them at scale do not come back nearly as quickly. And there's a deeper irony sitting underneath that entire reconstruction argument, too. The exact conditions that would actually revive this industry, an end to the fighting and a genuine lifting of Western sanctions, are precisely the outcomes the Kremlin launched this war determined to avoid in the first place. Russia's steel industry cannot fully recover from a war that Russia itself is still choosing to continue. So look at where this leaves one of the most important industries inside Russia's entire wartime economy. A single, fragile international supply chain feeding its most critical military steel plant. An overall industry running at its lowest output in 15 years, even with military factories buying at capacity. A domestic customer base crushed by the same war spending the industry is meant to support. Western trade rules tightening with every passing quarter. And a government that has already told its own steel producers, in plain terms, that there simply isn't enough money left to help. Steel isn't the only pillar of Russia's war machine showing cracks like this either. The other one is people, and that shortage is arguably even harder for the Kremlin to solve than a shortage of ferrochrome. That's exactly what we covered in our last video, where leaked government documents revealed Russian officials openly admitting, in their own words, that contract soldier recruitment had dropped by a full third, forcing entire regions to squeeze businesses and even hospitals for new recruits just to fill the gap. If today's story showed you a factory struggling to find the raw material it needs to keep building weapons, our last video shows you an army struggling to find the men needed to use them. Go watch it next, because together these two stories reveal the exact same pattern playing out across Russia's entire war effort. The machine keeps demanding more, and the country underneath it has less and less left to give. This is the Frontline show, and this war is moving faster than almost anyone is prepared for. We'll see you in the next one.